Hello. I am
Hello.
chatting with Zennistrad1, who is a YouTuber who I believe has a kind of progressive feminist-ish channel. But I want to ask you about that. Like, what
Mostly.
kind of channel, or like, what's your, I don't know, what's your beliefs?
Well, I would describe myself as being pro-feminist broadly. I generally tend to support feminism. I support social justice movements and things like that. Until recently, I identified as progressive, but thanks to my continued disillusionment with American liberal politics, I've actually found myself more attracted to left-wing anarchist movements, which puts me at odds with a lot of my friends. So
Really? Well, I had some friends who were anarchists, but I found that they couldn't explain well how anarchy would work. I was always asking questions like, well, what would you do about the roads, and
I
what would you
actually
do about this, and what would you do about that? And they never had like satisfactory answers, but like maybe you do. I don't. Yeah.
that actually depends a lot, because it's the trickiest thing about anarchism is that it requires a fuck ton of reading, and I still have to do a lot more reading, which I don't necessarily have time for. But based on what other people have said, I've just come to the belief that modern liberal progressivism just isn't going to provide any sort of satisfactory answers as long as these economic systems and social systems that we have in place exist, because they will always serve as a significant roadblock to what ultimately needs to be accomplished in order to protect the environment, in order to protect workers, in order to protect the rights of women, transgender folk, black people, etc., etc. I just think that modern politics will always have these obstructive assholes who just aren't going to let anything happen. And I think that the interests of the rich and powerful are just plain not going to let social progress happen in the way that it actually needs to happen.
So would you say it would be like a series of collectives or something, or like a bunch of fiefdoms or some shit, or you know?
I'm actually still trying to figure that out, to be honest. I know that there are several people who I identify as anarchists who are anarcho-communists. There are people who I know who identify as mutualists, which is a slightly different variety of that. And there are actually even some other people who I know of who support a very strange form of anarchism called what's known as libertarian municipalism, which is the idea, which I guess is the belief that society should be organized into a series of loosely collected and loosely associated municipalities, which would I guess not technically be states, in that they would be run from the bottom up rather than from the top down, but they would essentially serve the same function as the state, in that they would provide people with a framework for implementing social policy.
Yeah. Well, like to me, the libertarian thing always seemed kind of like a feudalistic system where you just have little.
Well, that's what I would say that anarcho-capitalists are, and most anarchists would argue that anarcho-capitalists are not actually anarchists, because the thing is that we tend to view the purpose of the state as being entirely different. Anarcho-capitalists think that the state exists in order to obstruct the interests of the capitalist class, and that in order to interfere with innovation and all of the good things that they think capitalism is associated with. But left-wing anarchists, by contrast, argue that capitalism as we know it cannot exist without the state, and that they are fundamentally intertwined with each other. They argue that the purpose of most state institutions is to protect private property. Like, for example, the police would be one of the things which we broadly believe exists mainly to protect the interests of those who hold private property. And there is a distinction that we generally make between private property and personal possessions. Private property would be property that you own, in a sense, but that you don't actually use. Rather, you you use it to exploit other people. One example of this would be being a landlord. If you're a landlord, you don't actually own the land, or you don't actually use the land, you do own it. It's just that other people use the land and they have to pay you in order to use it. And that would be the sort of exploitative relationship that anarchists would oppose. That's what we generally mean when we say that property is theft.
Yeah. Is that whole Marxist distinction? Like, everyone is always going on and on about Marx, like Marx this, Marx that, but so many of the people who go on about it, I think, haven't actually bothered reading any of his stuff.
That's actually a huge problem. I will admit.
Yeah.
It's Marx is definitely really hard to read. Like, if you've ever seen Capital at a bookstore, it's like this freaking door
exactly.
stopper. So very few people who a lot of people who identify as Marxists haven't actually read Marx, but
But I mean, one of the things in Marx was the distinction between, I forgot the exact words, private property and personal property. And they were saying they were against private property, and private property is defined as, I guess that includes
I don't think it was actually,
houses and property.
I don't think it was actually Marx who came up with it. I don't know if it was actually Marx who came up with that distinction. I think it might have been someone before him. Like Pierre Joseph Proudhon, or if that's how you pronounce his name. I've never actually heard it, but he was one of the earliest anarchists, and he came up with the phrase "property is theft," which is what most of us will broadly agree with. And if someone does not agree with him, then we'll probably tell you that they're not actually an anarchist. But yeah, Marx drew on a lot of when he wrote Capital, he drew on a lot of the work that was made before him by some writers of, for example, the French Revolution. It's just that he sort of expanded upon it with a level of detail that really hadn't been seen before with most of these workers' movements.
Yeah,
and there is generally speaking, there is sort of a very broad conflict between anarchists and Marxists, because Marx believed that the only way to bring about worker control of the means of production was to take state power, and that once the revolution was finalized, the state would just melt away, leaving behind a stateless and classless society. Anarchists disagreed with that because they think that the state is fundamentally corrupt by design, and that you can't bring about worker control over the means of production by taking control of the state, because the state will always work against the interests of workers. And generally, I think that anarchists' disagreement with Marx has been vindicated by history if you just look at every single country that has ever declared itself socialist.
But so do you think, like, they do want to eliminate, well, they want to eliminate a kind of government control, which is currently in existence now. And do they want to eliminate, like, people, I don't know, people owning houses and shit, and, you know? You
can own a house. It's just that under an anarchist system, you won't be able to, or at least you wouldn't have any incentive to rent that house over to someone else.
Yeah.
Everyone would. So
I guess I guess you have banks too. No, I mean, banks are part of capitalism. So
not necessarily. There are some forms of socialism, like socialism in the anarchist context just means that workers themselves own and control the means of production rather than a distinct capitalist class. So you don't have to sell your labor to someone else. In some economic systems, such as mutualism, people actually do actually have banks, and they do actually have money. It's just that everyone basically doesn't sell their labor to someone else. They own their own labor, and they own the fruits of their own labor. So it's basically a system wherein everyone essentially ends up working for themselves.
Yeah. So, but you'd say you're less in the communist arena these days and more in the anarchist arena, or is it like anarcho-communism, or like, what do you call it?
Anarcho-communism is a form of communism, but most of us just call ourselves anarchist in most contexts, specifically because communism has become such a dirty word, and because most people who self-identify as communists are going to be Marxist-Leninists or some variation thereof, and we generally speaking cannot stand them whatsoever.
Yeah. Well, to me,
generally speaking, I'm sorry, you can continue.
I was going to say, well, to me, like I base my judgment of these systems just on efficacy, like how well are they working for the most amount of people. And I think a place where communism falls flat is that it's got numerous deficiencies, which you need like a hybrid system, I think.
Well, the thing is that the biggest problem, I think, with anarchist political systems is that there have been several attempts so far, but we can't really judge them by how well they've worked because almost all of them have ended up being conquered or taken over by a state that had greater resources. The biggest
maybe
example
that always happens. So I don't. Yeah.
So that's actually one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now when it comes to figuring out how exactly we would try to defend ourselves against a larger state that would just come in and seize all of our resources. Because that's the biggest example I can think of that would be the Ukrainian Free Territories, which were an attempt at forming an anarcho-communist society shortly after the Russian Revolution, but then the Bolsheviks came in and just took over and then ruined everything. So that's actually one of the biggest issues is figuring out how exactly that would end up being accomplished and trying to work out the logistics. And that's actually the biggest source of disagreement among anarchist movements. Yeah. We all agree that capitalism and the state both need to be done away with. We're trying to figure out what exactly we're going to do next after that.
But couldn't you say part of the reason that capitalism always seems to take over is that it's partly a reflection of human nature? Like, you want dominance.
Oh, here we go. The human nature argument. That's an old one.
Is it? I'm not making any arguments. It's just what came to mind. But
that's probably the single oldest argument against communism. And I think it was the anarcho-communist writer Peter Kropotkin who actually wrote something that was addressing the human nature argument. I think it's called "Are We Good Enough?" I don't remember like exactly what it says, but Peter Kropotkin made the belief that human nature is not actually selfish in the way that people normally think of when it comes to when it comes to capitalism and self-interest and generally that sort of thing, that sort of idea towards corruption. What he argued was that it's actually in our nature to support each other, to act in our own mutual interest, and to cooperate with each other. And it's the way that so.
Maybe it's both, because I mean those are both part of human nature, aren't they?
To some extent, yes, but I think the difficulty is in figuring out to what extent it's nature or nurture, and we tend to generally lean towards the conception that people are raised in this capitalist system where they are kind of made to think in this sort of pull yourself up by your bootstraps way. Even like people who are progressive, even people who are progressive tend to think this way to some extent, and it's so ingrained into our way of thinking because that's what we've been taught to think.
But when I say like maybe it's part of human nature, I don't mean that as a like positive way of saying like capitalism is the right system. I mean that is in terms of like why over time does it slowly start to like dominate other systems that aren't necessarily set up to like resist that kind of, you know, laissez-faire attitude, the kind of Ayn Rand thing.
Well, most efforts to resist capitalism, I think, have not actually done a very good job of resisting capitalism. Because, like, if you look at what happened in the Soviet Union after it was first formed, they had no intention of abolishing the state or wage labor or money. The Soviet. And in many cases, the Soviet government actually worked against the interests of workers. Like the Communist Party was in charge of everything, and they often ended up exercising authority over actual workers groups in a way that kind of undermined what those workers groups were trying to accomplish. And this actually, I think, goes into what anarchists have been saying, is that you can't try to deal with capitalism by taking over the state, because state the state and capitalism are fundamentally intertwined with each other. And in fact, a lot of people refer to the Soviet Union as being just state capitalism. It's not actually socialism. It's just capitalism of a different flavor.
Yeah, well, wouldn't the whole thing be undermined by Stalin consolidating a centralized government, basically? You know, that was pretty totalitarian control, really.
Totalitarian control, but most anarchists would argue that in that instance, Stalin's government basically ended up serving the same function as the capitalist class by exercising its authority over workers in such a manner.
Yeah, well, that would very much undermine the idea that he was like the perfect socialist, wouldn't it?
Of course, we fucking hate Stalinists. They're the worst people ever. We even have our own nickname for them. Like, you know how anti-feminists tend to call feminists SJWs. Well, anarchists tend to call Stalin sympathizers by their own derogatory name. That is tankies, and those are the people who we just
never heard of that. What is it? Tankies?
I'm not sure, but I think it originated the name originated during the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. And basically tankies was just the term for the people who supported sending the tanks in.
Oh, yeah. Oh, okay.
and over time, it's just gradually come to mean an authoritarian jackoff who thinks that he's a communist.
Yeah. Well, I mean, to me, there's three writers throughout history who are, maybe including a fourth person who was not a writer, but who have been completely misused and abused in every possible way. And to me, it's like Marx, Nietzsche, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and then the last one was Jesus, you know. So,
Nietzsche.
If they came back and saw all of the shit that had cropped up from the stuff they'd said, I think all of them would be like, what the fuck is going on?
Like people still think that Nietzsche was a nihilist, and that pisses me off to no fucking end. Like, he was like the opposite of a nihilist.
He hated anti-Semites, and the Nazis used him as their philosopher-in-chief. He wrote a famous letter to a friend where he said, I just found out another friend of mine is an anti-Semite, and this kind of sucks because now I have to cut off all contact with him because anti-Semites make me sick. And I was like, he's the Nazi philosopher.
Yeah, that's basically how it went. People tend to use probably another person who I'd say is frequently misused is Martin Luther King, like by these like weak ass liberals who try to say things, who try to quote his "I have a dream" speech, and it's like literally the only quote that they'll ever use when they're like, acknowledging the existence of privilege is racist because you're judging us by our skin color. And I'm like, okay, no, we're not judging you by your skin color. We're judging you by how the rest of society judges you by your skin color.
Yep.
That's different. That's a different thing. And secondly, if you heard some of the shit that Martin Luther King said, without knowing that it was Martin Luther King, you would think that he was a radical. You would think that he was an SJW. He said, most white people are racist. He was heavily opposed to capitalism. And he said that if you said that if you ignored an injustice, you were just as culpable for it, that you were an accomplice to it.
Yep.
And I think that any one of those things would have pissed off a lot of these dipshit liberals who just go off whining about social justice warriors to no end if they heard that without knowing who said it.
Yeah, isn't that kind of like how the media and everything changes your perception of somebody when they're kind of deified, you know, like Ronald Reagan and stuff? Because of how the conservative media has treated Ronald Reagan, now he's like this conservative god, even though he did all this liberal shit. And the same with like Martin Luther King. He's like the safe black man who, you know, he's the go-to guy for like people like Bill O'Reilly. They're like, Martin Luther King wouldn't have thought this or done this, or, you know, Martin Luther King did it the right way. And it's pretty sure if Martin Luther King was alive today, they'd all be calling him Al Sharpton or Louis Farrakhan and being like, look at this fucking disgusting liberal.
No doubt that is totally true.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Like, there is literally nothing that Black Lives Matter is doing today that the civil rights movement of the 60s did not do. Like, if you are opposed to Black Lives Matter, I know just right off the bat what side you are on, because it's exactly the same thing. Like, if you're opposed to Black Lives Matter, then you're not the people who would have marched with Dr. King. You are the people who would have been.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. Like Martin Luther King, I'm pretty sure he would. Well, I can't speak for the dead. Like, everyone does that, but he probably would side with Black Lives Matter. I can picture that. And then everyone would say, like, horrible Martin Luther King, scumbag.
It's just, and I think that in a lot of ways, what's happening today is a lot of the social and political turmoil that's happening today is a mirror of the kind of social unrest that was happening in the 60s and the early 70s, because I think that we're living in a generation where young people have become particularly disillusioned with the way things work, and that's ended up not only in sort of a generational divide, but it's also led to like a bunch of other different conflicts, and in how we sort of perceive the world, and how we sort of communicate with each other, and how we sort of try to bring about the change that we want to see in the world.
Yeah.
And I think that in like 4 or 5 years' time, most of this seemingly eternal flame war about like SJWs and that sort of stuff will just die down, and people will find a new thing to hate on, because in 2006 it was fun. It was the big thing that people were arguing about was religion, but now that everyone agrees that fundamentalists and Christians are wrong, and that religious people just don't know what they're talking about, at least as far as this whole online discourse comes, because the internet doesn't work the same way that real life does. On the internet, you'll mostly find atheists talking about political issues, but in real life, most people are still religious. It's just that now that this sort of online discourse has turned away from making fun of religious people, we've sort of just turned on each other, because we realize that we don't agree on anything other than that fundies suck.
Yeah. I'm personally against all of these groups of like being part of a group. Fucking like Sargon of Akkad or whatever, he's always like, I'm anti-collectivist, blah, 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 blah. But he follows his whole anti-feminist, bro team, like hanging out with fucking Milo Yiannopoulos, whatever. I'm not interested in any of this like group stuff. So like some people call me regressive, and then other people say I'm not regressive, and then some people say I'm a social justice warrior.
Well, the thing that bothers me about that is that Sargon, a lot of the time he makes no effort to distinguish between like the different types of feminism, and how they often come into like severe conflict with each other. Like his he has an entire, like, he's dedicated like an entire video series to why people hate feminism, and I'm like, okay, what kind of feminism are you talking about?
Yeah, I don't understand dedicating your whole life to just attacking one aspect of one thing, and then just saying that aspect of that thing is what that thing is, and that's all you say, and that's all he says, like, every single day.
Yeah, and the thing is, though, I think that when I did my live stream with him, I think that he talked about how he used to be. I'm not sure if I'm remembering this right, so I don't know if this is exactly true or anything, but I think he's talked about how he used to hang out on MGTOW forums, and I think he said something about it being like after a particularly messy breakup or something.
Yeah.
But I'm saying I think that in a lot of cases, what side people fall on is something that falls in line with previous experiences, because I know that a lot of people who end up like utterly hating feminism are people who had a bad experience with someone who was especially vocal or especially obnoxious about their support of feminism. But in turn, I've noticed that a lot of those people who are especially vocal or especially obnoxious about their support of feminism are people who have had a bad experience with things like rape or harassment, or just not being taken seriously, or being mocked by anti-progressives, or ridiculed or harassed by them. And I think that this sort of informs the way that we conduct our discourse, because I'm willing to admit right up front that I am biased about quite a lot of things, and I think that I wish that a lot of people would recognize that they are also biased. Nobody is as rational as they believe themselves to be. I don't think that anyone is anywhere near as intelligent as they make themselves out to be. And I think that the first step to wisdom is understanding that. I think Socrates was entirely on the money there. So it's a sort of a struggle, because sometimes I see people who say things that really just piss me off, and I recognize that sometimes I occasionally slip up and say something that's kind of rude or just uncalled for, and sometimes I say things that are just wrong, and I think that's always constantly a struggle that I have to deal with. But I don't think it's fair to say that SJWs are the only people who have this problem with being biased or with being this
You're cutting
way,
out some. I can't hear 1% of what you're saying, but but it sounds good.
Yeah, it's fine. I'm sorry about that. It's just, this is something that I kind of feel passionately about, because it's sort of one of my frustrations, and it's weird, you know. Like, you said that you wanted to talk about politics, like, didn't you? Because that's what we were kind of talking about, but then we kind of got distracted by this whole, like, you asking me about, like, what my specific political beliefs are. But I want to ask you, like, what are your thoughts on the current state of the U.S. election? Because that's something that I've been kind of following, and it's something that I find very interesting, because it's a very different election from the last few ones that I've remembered, which, granted, isn't exactly a whole lot, since I'm only like 23 years old, but it's something that I've had a lot of interest in, and I'm interested in hearing what your perspective on it is, and what your thoughts are on what's going down over here on this side of the world, I guess.
On what? On the politics thing?
Yeah, like what are your thoughts on the whole on the whole presidential race? Like, I want to know, like, what's your perspective on the whole, like, on the whole issue of Donald Trump and the other GOP frontrunners, and this whole, like, Hillary Clinton versus Bernie Sanders civil war that liberals seem to be going through right now?
Well, I can't fully make out your question, but you said my thoughts on, like, American politics and what's going on there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Is the audio cutting out again?
Yeah, it just keeps cutting out so much. It's real hard for me to hear what you're saying. But I know that when I stop the broadcast and it uploads, that you'll be able to hear it, and probably the audience can hear it. It's just my shitty bandwidth, basically. So
I'll say something in the chat so you can answer my question.
Oh, right. Okay. It's funny how fucked up it is. I don't know. It's my fault. I've got just, like, shitty internet. So I heard you were saying something about politics and how perfect it is. No,
no, absolutely not. So you can see in the chat, right?
Oh, which chat? You mean the YouTube chat? Or...
It's not in the chat. It's on Google Hangouts.
Oh, the Google. Oh, yeah. Sweet. All right. Doopity doop 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 doop. Oh my God, there's, like, actual people watching this. There's, like, a chat thing with some people. What the fuck? That's not right. What are they doing? There's important things happening in the world. What are your thoughts on the Republican and Democratic primaries thus far? Well, like, today is Nevada, isn't it? So
yeah, Hillary just won Nevada.
Yeah, and I looked at an NPR page with all the delegates, and, like, Hillary has, like, 500, and Bernie's only got, like, I don't know, 50 or something.
Well, most of that is because of the super delegates, which have promised to support her.
Right, so Bernie's probably going to lose, right? I mean, everyone is really hopeful.
That depends. That depends, I think. But I think that, like, ultimately, people are afraid that Bernie Sanders is going to win. That's why I think that a lot of the media is concentrating so much on kind of slamming him for the things that he's saying. I think that's if they didn't think that he was a threat, they wouldn't care about him in the slightest. And yet it's quite clear that the mainstream media does care, and they're kind of really, like, hyper focusing on him in a lot of ways. And a lot of outlets are saying that his plans are just unfeasible, and how they're too idealistic and stuff like that. I think the reaction, like, generally says something about how afraid people are that he will end up taking power.
Yeah, like that CNN dude, or like one of them was like, Mr. Sanders, like when people hear socialism, they think Hugo Chavez and Venezuela, and they think, I don't know, Cuba and Castro, and it's just like he's doing all he can to make Bernie Sanders look scary, you know. And Hitler had National Socialist in the title. It's like,
Hitler was not a socialist. And you know what? Fuck it. I'll say it. Bernie Sanders is not a socialist. He is, at best, a social democrat, and that's not the same thing.
According to the media, he is Stalin reincarnate, basically.
It pisses me off so much that, you know, Bernie Sanders could not have ever believably called himself a socialist if it weren't for the fact that American politics over the past, like, 50, 60 odd years has diluted the term's meaning so much.
Just Americans are so scared of it.
You can refer to Hitler, Stalin, Obama, and Bernie Sanders as socialists, and odds are a considerable number of people will believe all of that.
Yeah.
So what? It's just.
It doesn't mean shit. It's like saying, I don't know, fucking Stalin had arms. You've got arms. How do you account for this fact? You both have arms. Like, oh, I don't know. Like, I'm an evil person.
Well, you know that Hitler liked dogs, right? So that means dog people must obviously be Nazis.
Oh yeah, but if Trump doesn't like dogs, then he's not fascist at all. That's how it works. But no, like, do you watch the TYT or Young Turks at all?
I used to watch them, but there are two reasons that I stopped watching them. And the first reason is that they just produce so many videos at once that I don't have the attention span to watch that. I just kind of lost interest. And the second reason, I think, is that they're really too flawed for me to really care for them in a lot of ways.
What do you mean?
Like I agree with quite a few of them on quite a few of issues. It's just that it's just that they really make it clear that they are just a bunch of they're just a bunch of weak ass liberals, just like just like all of the just like all of the people who have grown so disillusioned with over the past year or so. So
it's just funny because, like, the other side goes after them so much for, like, being too nice to Muslims or something, and
like I agree with Cenk that Sam Harris is like fucking atrocious, but it's just that I think that in a lot of ways it's how he chooses to make his argument that really turns me off to what he's saying, because I think that.
Sorry, the what argument?
Like there are better ways, I think, to go after Sam Harris. For example, his defense of profiling can be demonstrated. Like, there has been actual research done on that shows that it just doesn't. It flat out does not work. Yeah. Any security expert will tell you that it doesn't work.
And the profiling thing.
Yeah. Oh my God, yeah. Like
I mean, before we get onto that, just the reason I brought up the Young Turks is because they're doing a lot of political coverage, and I think their political coverage is probably the best part of their show, and that they made a really good point recently that they had this, like, CNN town hall for the Republican candidates, and they asked them questions like, what's your favorite martini, or like, what do you sing to your wife, what's your favorite color, like, how do you meet your wife? Like, that was kind of a rhyme there. But the next day they had a town hall for the fucking Democrats, and it was all like, are you going to be like Hugo Chavez? Or like, are you going to be like Fidel Castro? How the fuck are you going to pay for this? And there was even some tough questions for Hillary, like, are you ever going to release the transcripts of your Wall Street things? And like, how can you say you're for the people when you get the stuff from Wall Street? It's just night and day, like, how the media treats the Republicans versus the Democrats. And I just thought TYT did a really good job of highlighting. That's why
I just can't help but laugh when people talk about the liberal media, because it's clearly not a liberal media. Like,
do you like puppies? Oh, tough question.
Like, I think actually Noam Chomsky said once that any liberal bias that the media has exists specifically for the purpose of giving the impression that this is what the left is, when no, this is not even close to what the entirety of the left is, because there's a whole range of beliefs that go utterly beyond that, and they're not even considered. So if the media does have a liberal bias, it's because they kind of want you to believe that this sort of non-threatening liberalism is what being on the left is about.
But you see TYT as kind of non-threatening liberals, I guess.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's just, yeah, it's just like there was this one thing that just made me want to slam my head into a wall, where they said that the Oregon protesters were like Marxists, and I'm like those like people who took over that state facility, and I'm like, no, no, I that was the point that just made me think that they had absolutely no clue what they were talking about, because I think that like a better show, the one that I like the most, I would say, is even though they are liberals, and I tend to not like really agree with the liberal perspective, one show that I really like is The Majority Report.
Oh yeah, I mean, yeah, the thing I like about The Majority Report is just when they like joking around and like.
Like they have a great sense of humor. Like like when
Sam everything.
Like when they did this segment about how Obama won the war on Christmas.
Yeah, that was good.
Like,
and I mean, people like Sam Harris must hate The Majority Report, because he calls Sam Harris like he who cannot be named. Because he's like, he doesn't want to like mischaracterize him by saying his name. They'll be like, "What? You straw man, Sam Harris." And you said Sam Harris.
Like, didn't you say something about like on your blog? I think you said something about there being like a Sam Harris decoder ring that only people who already agree with him can understand what he's saying.
Yeah, it's like a special code that like only Sam Harris fans can get. You know, it's magic. But I think that's one of my favorite, like the funniest parts of The Majority Report is when they talk about Sam Harris, because I know that so many people are getting so offended by that. And that's kind of, it's, you know, because people can't stand it. They're just like, how dare you even talk about him, you monster, you know?
That's what, you know, what really I just can't help but laugh when people who complain about how SJWs are so oversensitive and how it's like reals over feels. They as soon as you make fun of someone who they like, or as soon as you make a joke about men, they will just suddenly and immediately get irrationally offended, and
yeah,
that's hilarious.
That too, you know. And I think, but to me, that sensitivity is not an ideological thing. Maybe
absolutely. It absolutely isn't. Like it bugs me when people characterize like I think that a lot of this whole thing about SJWs being like oversensitive and being a bunch of whiners is something that just it's been an anti-progressive. It's been an anti-progressive and anti-left-wing in general propaganda for centuries to characterize people pushing for social change as just being whiners. So
there are times when people on the left. And that's such a vague thing to say, people on the left, but people always say these broad things.
The reason that I say that is because generally it's framed as being against progressives, but progressives are not the entirety of the left, as I can personally attest to. So that's generally why I say that.
But I think there are examples of people being too sensitive, but I also think that the way that it's framed in the mainstream is generally unfair, because they're just taking things like, you know, people don't want to have derogatory names thrown at them when they're just hanging out in a regular place, and there might be like an optional safe space or something, and then people turning that into like the biggest nightmare of like Orwellian proportions.
Yeah, absolutely.
Ever, you know?
Like, absolutely. Like, I actually agree with that. Like, my perspective on the whole controversy about like safe spaces and stuff is that people tend to act as though these dang SJWs and these student protesters and stuff like that are basically the sole driving force behind all of these things that they say are terrible. And I do agree that on college campuses that sort of thing can get out of hand in some cases. The problem is they don't really seem to understand that there is no possible way in which student activists could have convinced these colleges to behave in this way on their own. I think that what people overlook is that like over the past several decades, the amount of public funding for universities, at least in the United States and several other countries like Australia and the United States, possibly New Zealand also, I'm not sure, but thanks to neoliberal economics, colleges are now receiving more and more of their revenue directly from tuition. Like, I think it's something like 47% of college revenue, of public university revenue, comes directly from student tuitions, and that's absolutely ridiculous. So basically what this means is that students are being treated like customers, and you know what they say about the customers always being right. So what the fuck did you expect for that to happen? You can't just push the blame. It's easy to put the blame on the people who are actually pushing for social change, but it's considerably harder to question these long-standing economic institutions that might have enabled things to get out of hand to begin with.
Well, to me, the main problem I have is just a matter of proportionality. The reaction against the sensitivity of these, quote, social justice warriors, because I don't particularly recognize that term, is completely out of proportion to actually what's happening in the real world. And that's just the problem that I have, is it's so, like, I can complain about it and say, I think they're being too sensitive and I think that's wrong, and I think that they should allow more freedom of speech, whatever, you know, just some talking points about how I am slightly against the SJWs, but that's got nothing to do with all these ridiculous arguments about fucking Mao in 1984 and like fucking, you know, they're coming to kill everybody and they're flinging rape accusations at everybody. And, you know, I think that's where it completely loses me. It's the proportionality. It's just not, it's not reality, you know. That's my problem with it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's just I've had experiences with people who I would consider to be like the more obnoxious kind of feminist, and for a brief period, I did actually kind of, I did kind of for a brief period, I was kind of on the fence on these issues. Like, I kind of understood why people hated these SJWs so much, but even then, I could still kind of see what was wrong with them. So I was kind of like, maybe, I don't know. But then I kind of realized that, like, the vast majority of people who spend so much time complaining about SJWs are people who really are terrible, at least in terms of their political opinions. Like, I wouldn't necessarily call all of them bad people when talking to them in person, but they have just awful opinions on social issues. And I do not trust the people who care the most about the problems in social justice movements to be the people to actually meaningfully criticize them, if that makes sense.
I think so. Could you say that again? I didn't fully get it.
It's just that I agree that social justice movements do have their problems, but the people who are most interested in criticizing them are the people who I trust the least in actually making fair criticisms.
Well, I mean, you expect those people to actually be involved in those movements in some way, not just people who are like, hey, I'm someone from the outside, I'm just going to come in and criticize the shit out of everything, which seems to be like what these guys are like. They're not involved in these movements. They kind of want to destroy these movements. They don't want to, like, help them or get involved in them.
That's exactly the problem that I have. You put that into words better than I could have, I think.
Yeah. Like Sargon, he's like, I don't think he gives a fuck about whether feminism succeeds. He's just like, I have to come tear shit down. You know, that's what it's all about.
He does give a fuck about whether feminism succeeds. I think that he just wants it to fail. I think he does give a fuck about whether feminism succeeds. I think he just wants it to fail.
Would you say that?
Well, because that's the thing. The thing is, though, is that he thinks that feminism, just broadly speaking, at least from what I can tell based on everything that I've seen of him so far, he just thinks that it isn't necessary anymore. And he thinks that it just does more harm than it does good. And I disagree with him on that. But to the best of my knowledge, that is generally how he actually sees it.
Well, but if he wanted to improve feminism, he would provide much more valid criticisms of it. And he wouldn't...
Exactly.
He wouldn't just take all these random clips and just cut them up and be like, you're an idiot, you're stupid. And then, oh, typical feminist. And then in one of the fucking videos, he's like, she's making a point. And then he's like, but look at her t-shirt. She's wearing a t-shirt with a stupid message on it. And it's like, that doesn't even address what she's talking about, for fuck's sake. You know, I think if he cared,
Yeah.
he'd try. I don't think he cares about feminism succeeding. I think that's not the same as caring about whether women succeed. Maybe he cares about that in his own way. But as for feminism, I think he just wants it to die. I think he wants to destroy it.
That's exactly what I was saying. But
oh, sorry, you cut off so much. I might have missed that.
It's fine. Like, internet, we are several continents away from each other, so I guess that's forgivable.
Yes. We could have just said the same thing independently. So, yeah. But do you want to talk about your controversy with him at all, or not really? I don't know if it's a controversy.
Not really. It's something that I kind of want to put behind me because I'm tired of it. Like, yeah. I think it's just I've resigned myself to the fact that we're never going to agree with each other. And, you know, I'm aware that he is very much capable of being nice. It's just that most of the time when he presents himself during his public persona, he doesn't act nice because he's dealing with people who piss him off. And I think admittedly, I do kind of fall into that same problem sometimes too. Like when I'm dealing with a commenter who says something that's like really, really ignorant or just is acting like an asshole, I do kind of tend to be dismissive of them. I've been trying to avoid that more recently, but it's hard not to just be. It's hard not to just be the asshole. It's hard not to not be the better person. So I think that if someone just comes into a comment section for the sole purpose of insulting me, I'm probably just going to like block them or anything. I have no problem with people disagreeing with me. It's just that I want to maintain at least some level of I want to maintain some like standard of discourse so that we don't just get dragged into this like petty name calling things. Yeah. And
but that's the thing, that this whole group mentality has totally distorted these conversations, because I can't count the number of conversations or at least exchanges I've had when somebody came in and they were like, well, do you condemn this? Do you condemn that? What do you think of this? What do you think of that? And the only reason they're sending me these materials is because in their mind, they're like, oh, he's kind of progressive / regressive / social justice warrior, and he liked a Kevin Logan video or he liked some other video, so obviously he has to defend this. And it's just like, you're not even like talking to me as a human being. You're just like, you think I'm some representative of some movement instead of, you know, why do I have to defend some random feminist who said something just because I agree with a lot of feminism? You know, I'm not the representative of feminism.
Well, that's I actually on Reddit. I recently received a private message from someone who asked me to, who pointed out that like a year ago I said something in support of Jenny McDermott, and since then I've come to realize that she's an asshole. She's a sex worker exclusionary feminist, and she
just told me to fuck off on her latest comments thread, so that was very friendly.
Yeah, it's been 6 months since I'm not interested in defending her. I think she's an asshole. Why are you trying to judge me based on this one thing that I said 1 year ago before I realized how much of a massive gaping asshole she is? So
that's true. But you know, that's the thing, is like, I can think that, you know, Jenny's kind of being an asshole sometimes, and still occasionally like some of her videos, and still think Sargon is kind of an asshole.
I just stopped following her for the trouble because
I mean, I've been criticized for being too friendly with people who seem hateful or something, but it's because I don't want to judge people based on that group mentality. I want to go on a case-by-case basis, and
yeah, that's like perfectly understandable. Like I actually like Kevin Logan's videos because I think that they're just really funny, but I often find myself disagreeing with some of the particulars of his arguments, and I usually don't say anything about it because I just don't have the time to get into like some massive flame war about that. But
oh, sorry, you got a flame war with Kevin?
No. What I was saying is that people do occasionally like judge me for like leaving a comment in support of one of Kevin Logan's videos, even though I do actually disagree with him on a lot of things. It's just that the reason that I don't like publicly voice my disagreement with him is that I don't think that it's worth the exhaustion of having to get into yet another flame war where everyone just kind of dogpiles on him for some shit that he said in one of his videos. And it's just not something that I kind of want to be involved in. And I do find myself getting dragged into that drama sometimes, admittedly, either because I lack self-control in some way or because it's just so hard to avoid sometimes. But it is something that I do want to try to avoid getting myself involved in.
Yeah. No, that's fair enough. I mean, on the internet, it's very hard to get involved in a discussion about stuff you're actually interested in and just exchange facts and information without it at some point turning into like, you're a fucking idiot. You don't know what you're talking about. You're like, you're a dumb cunt. Why'd you write that, you piece of shit? You're a liar, whatever. It always turns into that kind of bullshit, you know?
Yeah.
I mean, there's this dude, Bane666 or something, who's this anti-feminist guy, and he included a snippet of one of my videos, which was, are feminists and SJWs authoritarian or totalitarian? And then he played a clip of me where I said Nazis shoved women and children into ovens and this kind of shit, whatever. And then he was like, notice he didn't mention men. Why is that? He's like, I'm just saying, it's very strange he didn't mention men. Maybe he thinks...
Oh my fucking God. Did he actually... That is grasping
and I was like,
at the
are you serious?
of straws. Like, that's the thinnest possible straw you could grasp.
It's like, it slipped my mind. That doesn't mean I think men should be murdered in the Holocaust. If I could go back and edit it and say men, I would. I just forgot to. Like, Jesus fucking Christ. Like, and to me, that's just like the worst type of arguing. It's just like, do everything you can to smear the person, you know?
Yeah, that's the... I think a lot of that can be owed to the kind of the promotion of this whole, like, I saw someone call it a friend of mine called it the interrupting cow style of YouTube video, and it's something that it's kind of a term that I've adopted, where you just play someone's video, then cut in to interrupt and like say something condescending to them. It was popularized, I guess, during the whole like YouTube atheist movement when that first started coming in.
It made more sense back then because creationists' points were so bad that you can cut into a creationist's point and just be like, that's bullshit. But if you cut into the middle of a sentence of someone who's trying to make a substantive point, then you've kind of fucked them over, you know?
Yeah, that's the thing that makes it so obvious that that's something it's just so... It's bullshit. It really is bullshit. And I think that, like, I'm working on a series of videos where I address certain claims about people, but I'm trying not to, like, cut them off or insult them or belittle them. Like, I'll start off the video with kind of like a snarky introduction where I kind of mock certain ideas. But for the most part, the rest of the video is mostly just going to be, like, trying to actually address what people are really saying. So,
yeah. Well, yeah, because on the Holocaust, the guy he was psychoanalyzing me, like, subconsciously, he thinks men should be killed. And I'm like, what? No, I don't. But you can tell, because I microanalyzed his sentence.
It is. I don't even know why I do YouTube anymore, to be honest, but it's just something that I do feel... I do think it's generally worthwhile, but sometimes I question it.
You question what?
And thankfully, I do. I like doing YouTube. It's just sometimes I question whether it's worth it.
Yeah. Oh, but you mean like having second thoughts about YouTubing or something? Yeah,
like I probably am going to.
I think everyone has that moment when they're like, "Do I want to be hanging out here?"
Not if you're making enough money on Patreon.
Yeah, that's a good point. Well, like, I have to be on here, so I'm just gonna find someone, tear them apart, and then make me some money.
Like I think Thunderfoot makes like $3,000 per pledged video, so of course he's going to keep doing YouTube for as long as he can.
He only does two things: he just blows things up, or smashes something, or he says, "Look at this stupid feminist," and that's that's all he does.
I still don't understand why people wouldn't think that Thunderfoot quote mines, because I think that it can be just plainly demonstrated that he does. Like, when people tried to defend his quote mine of like Anita Sarkeesian with, well, she still thinks everything is sexist, and I'm like, well, no, if you actually take a look at her other opinions, it's quite clear that she does not literally think everything is sexist.
Oh, you're talking about the Anita Sarkeesian thing?
Yeah, like it's so dumb. Like, I don't get why it's so hard to understand that she does not literally believe that everything is sexist, and yet I've heard people argue that to me, which is absolutely bonkers. And Thunderfoot has had an extensive history of quote mining, so I actually demonstrated that again.
You know, my impression of that was when you study something, you are going to be mired in that subject. So it's like if you are studying like World War II, and then she was saying, you know, when I do the social study subject, like we're looking at patriarchy all the time, so it makes me think everything's racist, everything's sexist, etc. If I was studying World War II, I'd be like, oh man, everything's just tanks and bombs and shit blowing up. And then I'd be at everything's war. I'd be at a party talking about Hitler and the war and talking about the Allies, and then someone would be like, I'm so sick of this guy talking about this shit. And I'd be like, well, I'm sorry, it's just what I'm studying. And that's all she was saying. She's saying like, I'm studying these subjects, so it makes me think about it all the time. I'm pretty sure that's all she was saying, right?
Yeah, like the thing is though is that people tend to take other people's words absolutely literally whenever it suits their argument, whenever it suits their attempts at character assassination. But other times when it's convenient to like defending their own opinions or defending the opinions of people who they agree with, suddenly there's all of this nuance that wasn't there before for any of their opponents.
Exactly. I think Anita is very like symbolic of the groupthink, because she's become like public enemy #1. So basically you can just, I don't know, poop on a plate and then say like, Anita Sarkeesian did something bad, look at this poop on a plate, and everyone will be like, that's a great point, she's horrible because of the poop on the plate. It's like, you don't even, you don't need any fucking evidence, or you just have to say she's horrible. Everyone will be like, good point, I hate her.
Yeah, like half of the arguments that I've heard against her have been like, oh, well, she's a horrible person, so therefore we should read her character. Like, she's a horrible person, therefore it's okay for us to be less than fair to her. That's basically what those arguments boil down to. And I'm like, no, not really.
Yeah, what is that?
And these are the same
character or something.
Yeah, it's a little more than an ad hominem, I would say, in a lot of cases.
And you also had the Aaron Ra thing, which was very interesting because, you know, Sargon made a response video where he's like, actually, I can't do an impersonation of that guy. It's difficult. Actually, that is what I preferred. And
no, that's too posh to be him. you have to be a lot more direct, more blunt.
I can't do it. But he was like, actually, that is what he's saying. Here's the whole clip. And then he played the quote unquote whole thing. And so I was curious. So I went and I watched it, and Sargon still cut out the line directly after what Aaron Ra said. And the following line was, but it's not a dichotomy, which is quite important information. He was saying, if you're not a feminist, you're a sexist. And then Sargon cut it there, but then he said, but it's not a dichotomy, and that bit got cut out. He then went on to describe it as a spectrum or a scale.
Wait. Are you saying that he defended against an accusation of quote mining by quote mining? Are you saying that he tried to defend against an accusation of quote mining by quote mining?
Yeah, in his response video, because I went back and watched it, and he cut out the bit where he said it's not a dichotomy, which was the line directly afterwards. He played all the stuff before, so he played like a minute, and then he was like, "See, that's the whole thing." And so then I watched it, and I was like, "But there's another line."
Okay, I was actually entirely not aware of that. I wasn't paying attention to the whole Aaron Ra thing, but I'll have to check that out, because if that is true, then that's quite.
Because I knew. Knowing about Sargon, I suspected that if I looked into this, there might be some other information. So I was like, I'm just going to play the whole thing, you know, with no cutting at all. Just watch all of it. He then goes on to say, well, I think they still won't like this point of view. He says the amount that you are feminist is the amount that you are not sexist. And he said that some people might not know whether that they're actually feminist and that they're agreeing with feminist ideals and stuff. And that's still controversial, and that's still a point you can take issue with. But it's still kind of quote mining to just cut that bit out completely.
Yeah, because it's a different argument when you take that into account.
It's still not an argument they'll like. They still won't like that argument. But
yeah,
it's a slightly different argument than just what Sargon said it was.
And that's the same thing that happened when people demonstrated that, like when I demonstrated that Thunderfoot quote mined Rebecca Watson, because well, like when you're talking about that quote mining, she's like, if you listen to the full quote, she's actually talking about how she was assaulted, not how she was just coming up with this buddy system for safety at conventions, like completely out of the blue. But she's like, yeah, well, you don't know if she actually was harassed or threatened by this one person. And I'm like, okay, so what? It's still a different argument because it changes the entire reasoning behind her little story. So it's still a quote mine.
I think it depends. It depends to what extent you want to give your opponent's arguments fidelity. If you really want to represent them properly, you'll go out of your way to do it. And if you don't give a fuck, you'll just do the Sargon thing. You know, it's really up to the person who's making the video. Yeah.
Yeah. So, fuck it. It's getting a little bit late here. It's like almost 9 at night. So I don't know how much longer I'm going to be able to talk. If there's anything else that you wanted to talk about, I guess like regarding like politics or current events, then I'd be more than happy to discuss that with you just for a little bit longer. But I do have to be winding down for the night.
That's all good. No, I mean, I've just enjoyed getting an overview of just some general topics that are going on right now.
Yeah, because I think this is we did end up getting kind of like a pretty good overview of what we believe and kind of our perspectives on these various issues in like politics and stuff like that. So,
well, I mean, yeah, you were complaining about wish-washy liberals. I'm probably a little bit wish-washy because I just kind of go with what seems to make sense, and in that way, I'm less activist than a lot of other people. And so I could be accused of being a bit wish-washy.
Like there are some liberals who I think are less. There are some liberals who I think are less wishy-washy than others. But broadly speaking, if you're a liberal, I'm probably not going to agree with you entirely on a lot of things.
Well, I mean, you know, some people are like everything is activism, but I don't think about everything in terms of activism. I think of it in terms of just discussions about topics. Really, it's a bit dull, but.
So it was nice talking with you, I guess. If you ever want to do another one of these hangouts, I guess I'll speak with you later. But for now, I think I should be signing off for the night. I guess I'll catch you later. For those of you who are wondering, I'm going to be mirroring this hangout once it gets uploaded onto my channel, and I will put a link in the description to Demotivator's channel and his blog, so you can check that out if you want, because I think he's a really cool guy.
Sweet.
Good. No problem. So with that said, I will see you later. All right. And
what? Oh, he left. Sweet. Have a good night, man.